As one of my favorite games of 2019, Ion Fury delivers an exceptional first-person shooting experience. The level design and presentation is pitch perfect, fully embracing that which made shooters in the 90s so engaging. Large, exploration-driven stages and fast action are the order of the day. And now it's finally available on consoles. At first glance, you'd think porting a game like this to a console would be a relatively simple task. After all, it's driven by technology created in the 90s, so it should be simple, right? Well, it turns out it's not so simple. So to better understand the process, I spoke with the developers to discuss their experiences in bringing a game like this to console platforms. So there's lots to discuss there, but we'll also check out the game running on each of these machines, plus what's up with the frame rate. There's a lot to talk about, so let's just get into it. When you start up Ion Fury on your console of choice, it makes a strong first impression. The visuals are a perfect match for the original PC game. It delivers that full-fat retro experience in all its glory. If you're playing on Xbox One X or PS4 Pro, the game even runs at a native 4K resolution, while all other consoles are 1080p. And in the case of Switch, it's even 1080p when played in portable mode, so that means downsampling from a higher resolution to the Switch's 720p LCD screen. It looks really nice. But it wasn't long before reports started coming out suggesting that there were some pretty significant performance problems with the Ion Fury console port. You see, Ion Fury aims for 60 FPS on all PS4 and Xbox One systems, while on Switch it's capped at 30 frames per second, though there is a way around this, as I'll explain shortly. So what's the issue? Well, right away I noticed an unexpected hitching that seemed to occur at regular intervals, resulting in a game that doesn't feel quite as fluid as it should. So I measured the frame rate using our tools to get to the bottom of that, but they didn't really fully demonstrate the issue. You see, it turns out the weapon sprite never misses a frame. It is 60 frames per second all the time, so the drops we see never actually register as a real frame drop. The screen is still updating each frame. By spinning in place, however, and bypassing the weapon bob entirely, suddenly the issue becomes clear. There it is. As you can see, the game is basically stuttering at fixed intervals, producing something visually similar to bad frame pacing, but it's 60 frames per second, so that doesn't make sense. Or does it? Well, this was the first question I had for the team at General Arcade. It turns out the issue relates to a timer. The build engine uses a rather complex timer subsystem that differs from anything in a modern game engine. So when working properly, the timer will increase by 2 with each new frame. The issue with this current build, though, however, is directly tied into this. At a fixed interval, the timer will lose this cadence, and you'll have the counter increase by just 1 for 1 frame, then by 3 to compensate for the missed update. This only has an effect on the world update though, not the graphics rendering, which is why the weapon sprite updates at a full 60 frames per second all the time. During development, the team relied on a profiler to gauge performance, which always reads 60 frames per second on these machines, but in reality, the issue was interrupting the fluidity. But here's the good news, the team has found the problem and already solved it, which means this will be included in an upcoming patch which should hit next week on PS4 and Xbox One at least. I'll be eagerly awaiting the results to see if it really truly solves the problem, because aside from these blips caused by the counter, the game runs very, very well. So the development team has managed to hit the performance target even if it doesn't seem like it at first glance due to this issue. But what about the Switch version? Well, the same problem applies to the Switch, but it's capped at 30 FPS, and as a result, it's even more noticeable. It basically looks like Bloodborne-style bad frame pacing. There will be a fix coming for the Switch as well, but it may take slightly longer due to delays in the Nintendo patching process, but there's more to the Switch version than this. You see, it is capped at 30 FPS for a reason. It couldn't maintain 60 FPS during gameplay. However, if you enter the classic Konami code during gameplay, well, this happens. That's right, the FPS cap is removed, and the game will draw as many frames as the Switch can muster. Depending on your preference, this could be a great feature, so do keep it in mind when you're playing the Switch version. It may especially be useful if, say, a Switch Pro or something like that were to emerge in the years following, right? Now, while we're talking about patches, the team is also adding the option to invert aim, which was not included by default, so that's good to know as well for those that prefer that style of play. So in the end, the frame rate issue I noticed wasn't even related to performance at all, but that doesn't mean reaching the target frame rate was simple, and this is where we get into the development side of things. The team initially accepted the job to port the game to console, thinking it would be relatively simple. After all, they had experience with Build, having ported Shadow Warrior to the iPhone in 2012, and developing Duke 3D Megaton Edition and Shadow Warrior Classic Redux for the PC. But Ion Fury is not the same. The game was designed using the more advanced feature set of eDuke 32, including true room-above-room design, the removal of level size limits, and a huge reliance on conscripting. This means larger levels with more complex layouts and geometry, more unique events, and other features that go way beyond the original Build Engine games. According to General Arcade CTO Sergey, the team started work first on Switch, since they could use OpenGL and other common libraries to begin development. The problem is, the first attempt yielded just 6 frames per second, even with scripts disabled. Now, I can imagine at this point it was immediately clear to them that this would not be such a simple job after all. So the first task was to figure out how to speed up the renderer. Ion Fury is built primarily around the hardware-accelerated PolyMost renderer, which enables a lot of advanced rendering features that were not possible in standard Build. On the PC though, there is still a software renderer as an option, but the software renderer wouldn't have been possible on consoles though, so PolyMost was selected for this problem. The issue is though, PolyMost is not well suited to these machines. It generates a huge number of draw calls and state changes, which all run from a single main thread on the CPU. The solution here was to implement batching, which involves combining as many of these draw calls together into a single call, but each batch must use the same textures, shaders, and blending modes. So the team implemented a texture atlas system which combines all textures and sprites into a single texture and shader. This is what allowed them to reduce the number of draw calls from well over 3,000 to around 100, which produced a significant boost in performance, around 10 frames per second on average. The other major benefit of using a texture atlas though comes in the form of much faster loading time, so moving between different areas is extremely quick. Of course, save games still take a little bit of time, and the game does autosave at various points, and that's when you'll see this little pause like this. The team attempted to reduce the size of the save games, but unfortunately due to the way the game works, it's just saving so much information in there, and in the end, each save is around 8 to 12 megabytes. Now, Sergey suggests that they basically turned PolyMost into a vertex processor which generates geometry data for each frame before passing it to the different APIs on each machine. Neat. Another issue with the game was the conscripting system. In the original Build Engine, this was used for simple things such as enemy AI and inventory management, but that's really about it. It was limited in what you could do for sure, but eDuke 32 greatly expands this feature, allowing developers to manipulate events, structures, camera positioning, physics, and more. And Ion Fury relies heavily on this. The problem is, this gobbles up CPU time and was using upwards of 50% of the CPU power available on the consoles just on script execution. So, Sergey and crew made the decision to convert all these scripts into C++. They created a basic translator program to convert the scripts, then spent a month debugging and optimizing from there. The result? A 10 to 15 frames per second boost. Now we're getting somewhere. The renderer then also received a significant overhaul designed to offload graphics calls to a separate thread instead of running everything on the main thread. And, once again, the performance improved. It really seems at this point that the team was making real progress. They also attempted to make better use of multi-core processing, but unfortunately were unable to implement this without breaking polymost, so it was scrapped. Another thing that they focused on was optimizing the way the room above room system works, which was slow in its original form due to double processing of the world geometry. Another solution was found here that massively sped things up. Then there's the sound playback, which you'd think would not be a problem, but it was. You see, the PC version uses OGG Vorbis files, but decompressing these files on the fly using the console CPUs caused a high CPU load, which of course reduced performance. So they first attempted to improve this by limiting the number of simultaneous sounds that could play at once, an option available in original Build Engine games, but in this case, it didn't sound great. Too many sound files were getting cut off, and it just didn't work. So the solution they ended up with was converting all the files to uncompressed WAV files, which have little impact on the CPU during playback, and then merging them all into a single chunk. Basically, think of this as a sound atlas. It increases the size of the game slightly, but in reality it's still rather small, and of course, performance is improved further. So when you combine all of these things, you start to gain an appreciation for what the team went through to win back all those frames. These are just some of the details, of course, but the takeaway here for me is that this was a challenging project due to the legacy roots of the engine. The evolution of build and the new features added in Duke 32 just didn't seem to take the consoles into account, and it turns out that a lot of the decisions made don't play nicely with those CPUs with low single-threaded performance. So, we already discussed resolution and frame rate then, but what about the rest of the package? Does it work well? I mean, even knowing the difficulties that the team faced in bringing it to consoles, is it still worth checking out? That's kind of the big question here, right? Well, that's the interesting thing. Aside from the world update issue, the game does play rather smoothly and it looks great on consoles, but I found it slightly more difficult to play. You see, it's pretty clear to me that the original game was made for mouse and keyboard, and I feel like the analog stick aiming here isn't quite as refined as I'd like. I actually found it best on the Switch Pro controller, oddly enough, and the Switch version even supports gyro aiming, which helps a lot, though they did indicate that this feature may be coming to PlayStation 4 soon as well. The main thing is that the dead zone and analog stick adjustments are just a little bit off. If you push it part way, the camera moves slowly, but push it all the way and it whips around at a high speed. It doesn't quite feel as if they dialed this in, but it still works well enough, honestly. That said, really, I prefer the original PC release. Once the patch hits, fixing the world update issue, adding inverted aim and all that, this should be a fantastic way to enjoy Ion Fury. It's still just as fresh as it was last year. The complexity of the level design, the quality of the artwork, the creative use of the build engine, and the pounding soundtrack all work in tandem to create a very memorable experience. It has the sensibilities of a retro shooter, but it still feels very fresh. Now, if you're looking at the different versions available on consoles, then I have to recommend playing on PS4 Pro or Xbox One X first and foremost, due to the higher resolution output. The Switch version is kind of the most disappointing of the bunch, given that it's either capped at 30 or running with an unstable frame rate. That's just a limitation of this engine on that platform. So looking at the broad spectrum of games designed around old technology then, this port sort of falls in the middle. It's not quite at the level of Night Dive's best games such as Turok or Doom 64, but it's still a cut above many others, and it is really nice to have this on consoles. Plus, since the physical release is coming later, one can assume that the patches being added to the game will be included in that version, so hopefully that version of the game will be the most polished one for console players. One thing's for sure, talking to the folks at General Arcade has helped me better appreciate what it takes to bring a game like this to a console. The sentiment is, it looks like a game from 1996, so it should run like a dream, but as you can see now, that's really not so simple. This game is extremely different on a technical level compared to modern renderers, and while it works okay on a PC, which has plenty of resources, it just doesn't work with these very limited console CPUs. Since this is mainly a CPU limited game, it is actually possible to run it at higher resolution, so you have to wonder, with next generation consoles on the horizon, maybe we'll get an updated version running at a full 8K. But That's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to let me know by liking, subscribing, following us on Twitter, and all that good stuff. And until next time, stay retro.